In the beginning of the movie, we're introduced to a lawyer named Mason, played by John Cena. We see Mason looking at a photo from his past when he was a Special Forces soldier. It turns out that before becoming a lawyer, Mason was an exceptional Special Forces operative. Since childhood, Mason had a passion for fighting, always stood up for his weaker friends. This led him to military training and eventually being selected for Special Forces. At one point, Mason was assigned to eliminate the president of Paledonia, who was considered cruel to his own people. However, on the way to Paledonia, Mason's helicopter and his team were ambushed by the president of Paledonia himself. In this incident, some of Mason's comrades lost their lives, but Mason managed to survive and return to his country. As a result, Mason decided to leave the military and pursue a career as a lawyer, a path he continues to follow. After reminiscing about his past for a while, Mason hurriedly went to drop off his daughter at school. During the car ride, Mason's daughter shared that one of her friends always bullies her. Here, Mason advised his daughter to just punch the bully in the face if necessary. After dropping off his daughter at school, Mason headed to the office to carry out his duties as a lawyer. Upon arriving, Mason received a visitor who turned out to be his former military superior named Sebastian. Sebastian intended to assign a mission to Mason, to guard a journalist. Upon hearing this, Mason immediately rejected the offer because he didn't want to deal with his old world again. Sebastian promised to pay Mason a hefty salary, and the location of the assignment was in the country of Paledonia. Mason's only task was to guard a journalist named Claire, who was going to interview the infamous President Paledonia, known for his cruelty to his own people. Sebastian deliberately chose Mason because of his past experience in combat there, even though it ended in failure. After hearing Sebastian's explanations, Mason asked for some time to think it over and promised to inform Sebastian the next day. That Mason went back to his daughter's school to pick her up. However, upon arrival, Mason saw his new wife being called by the teacher because their daughter had just hit a boy on his throat and had to be taken to the hospital. The daughter claimed that she learned it from her father. Naturally, Mason's wife was furious, considering Mason had supposedly taught their child something negative. Moreover, they had to bear the boy's hospital expenses and pay a fine to the school. Mason's wife didn't know where to find the money, as Mason hadn't given her any for several months. Feeling guilty, Mason asked his wife for permission to accept Sebastian's mission. He believed that this way, he could earn a significant amount of money. At first, Mason's wife refused to allow him to go because she was afraid he wouldn't come back. However, due to the desperate situation and no other options, she eventually gave Mason permission to leave. Mason immediately informed Sebastian that he was ready to carry out the mission. Sebastian then asked Mason to meet Claire in her office. Long story short, Mason met Claire and informed her that he was sent by Sebastian to guard her during the interview with President Paledonia. Afterward, Mason and Claire quickly departed for Paledonia to meet the president. Arriving at Paledonia Airport, Claire and Mason were warmly welcomed by the president, Venegas. Mason remained vigilant and kept his distance from Venegas, fearing a trap. Later, Venegas took Claire and Mason to the presidential palace for the interview. However, during the journey, their convoy was unexpectedly attacked by a group of unknown assailants. Seeing the attack, Mason sprang into action to ensure Claire's safety. In the end, Mason successfully eliminated all the attackers. At this point, Mason accused Venegas of orchestrating the attack, but Venegas swore that the assailants were not his people. Moreover, they seemed intent on harming Venegas. For several months, Venegas had been facing sudden attacks, and that was the reason he wanted to be interviewed by Claire, to expose these incidents to international news. Hearing this, Mason wasn't quick to believe, so he chose to leave Venegas with Claire. During the journey, Mason contacted Sebastian, asking for a rescue helicopter because they had just been attacked by an unknown group. Upon hearing this, Sebastian requested Mason to send the location, as a rescue helicopter would arrive in 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, a helicopter appeared, but it wasn't Sebastian's. It was the enemy group still chasing Mason and Claire. Realizing this, Mason swiftly took Claire, leading to a chase with gunfire. In the midst of the chase, Mason aimed at the helicopter's pilot, and with his experience as a Special Forces soldier, he managed to bring down the helicopter. After the helicopter was destroyed, two enemies remained and cornered Mason and Claire. At that moment, Mason and Claire could only resign themselves as escaping seemed impossible. Suddenly, one of the enemies was shot in the head, and it turned out to be Venegas, who saved Mason and Claire. It was then that Mason finally believed that those people were not Venegas' henchmen, and they united. Later, Venegas invited Mason and Claire to rest in a village, as it was not far from Venegas' hometown. The scene shifted to a mercenary named Colonel Jan, who was contacted by someone. The mysterious caller asked Colonel Jan to hunt down Venegas, along with Mason and Claire. The identity of the mysterious caller remained unknown, but one thing was certain: they're up to no good. Back to Venegas, who has now arrived in his hometown with Mason and Claire. Venegas' arrival is warmly welcomed by all the villagers, and he receives appreciation from the village chief, who is Venegas' childhood friend. After that, Mason, Claire, and Venegas decide to clean themselves up. However, when they finish bathing, it turns out there isn't a single towel there, so the three of them have to come out with nothing on. A few hours later, Claire is finally interviewing Venegas with makeshift equipment, watched by the villagers. Claire asks why Venegas is infamous for being so cruel to his people. Venegas responds that it's all just slander, because he is not like that at all. This is evidenced by the villagers who seem to love Venegas. Venegas explains that their land is rich in a rare metal called lanthanides, and powerful nations want that resource. This is one of the reasons why there's so much bad news about Venegas. They want Palladonia destroyed so they can freely exploit lanthanides. However, Venegas won't let that happen. He'll do everything in his power to protect his country. The villagers cheer in support of Venegas. Mason is seen starting to believe in Venegas after hearing the recent interview. That night, Venegas, Mason, and Claire continue to stay in the village. Claire, sharing a room with Mason, is tempted by Mason's muscular body and invites him to play. However, the loyal Mason rejects Claire's advances. The next day, Mason asks Venegas about the person who keeps sending troops to attack him. Venegas suggests that Mason inquire with the person who ordered him to come here. Mason quickly contacts Sebastian, as he's the one who gave Mason this mission. When connected, Sebastian explains that he intentionally sent Mason to guard Claire because he anticipated numerous attacks. If another guard were in charge, Claire might not have survived until now. Mason then asks about the people who attacked them. Sebastian explains that the attacks are orchestrated by the African government, aiming to seize Palladonia by eliminating Venegas. Furthermore, the African government has collaborated with Venegas' nephew, who serves as the vice president, to eliminate Venegas. Hearing all that, Mason finally understands that Venegas is innocent, and now he intends to protect him as well. Shortly after, the village is unexpectedly visited by a group of mercenaries, led by Colonel January. It turns out Colonel Jan is paid by the African government to hunt down Venegas. Ruthlessly, Colonel Jan immediately seizes the village head to force him to reveal Venegas' whereabouts. Venegas, not wanting the village head to become a victim, surrenders himself on the condition that none of the people in his village be harmed. When Venegas is about to be taken away, Mason, along with Claire, arrives on horseback and rescues Venegas, leading to a chase. In this incident, Claire is captured, while Mason continues to escape, taking Venegas away from Colonel Jan's pursuit. Feeling safe, Venegas recounts the past events, mentioning an American military helicopter shot down by African mercenaries in this area. Hearing this, Mason realizes that the forces Venegas mentioned in his story were Mason's own forces. Now, Mason also learns that the attackers were African mercenaries, not Venegas' men. Mason can only remain silent, feeling a deep sense of guilt for having once considered Venegas a villain. Afterward, Venegas agrees to exchange himself for Claire, as Claire is innocent in all this. Quickly, Venegas takes Mason to the home of a friend named Eduardo. Here, Venegas seeks Eduardo's help to facilitate the exchange between himself and Claire, who is being held hostage by Colonel Jan's crew. With pleasure, Eduardo agrees to assist Venegas. The next day, Colonel Jan is seen holding Claire hostage. Suddenly, Venegas, Eduardo, and several villagers arrive, causing chaos. In the midst of the turmoil, Mason manages to free Claire and takes her to the state palace. Before leaving, Venegas invites Mason to join because he plans to broadcast live from the state palace to explain the true events to the world. On the other side, it shows Venegas' nephew, the vice president, sitting leisurely in the state palace, assuming that Venegas is already dead. Shortly after, he is startled by Venegas' arrival with Claire and Mason. At the same time, the traitorous army commander also arrives and attacks Venegas, leading to a gunfight. In the end, the army commander is eliminated and Venegas' nephew also falls victim to gunfire. Shortly after, more soldiers arrive and point their guns at their own president. They believe that Venegas killed his nephew and the army commander. Venegas firmly explains everything that has happened, eventually convincing the soldiers. A few minutes later, Colonel Jan and his forces arrive, leading to a firefight between them and Venegas' loyalists. In the midst of the battle, Mason finds himself cornered by Colonel January. Fortunately, Claire comes to his aid. Mason then goes on a rampage, with Claire broadcasting his actions live through her phone. Before long, Sebastian and his forces arrive, turning the tide and eliminating Colonel Jan's troops. Several days later, the truth about Paledonia is broadcasted on all TV channels worldwide. Now the whole world realizes that President Venegas is actually a good person, falsely accused by greedy individuals who desire the country. Mason's wife, witnessing her husband's heroic actions on television, becomes extremely proud as Mason has saved the nation of Paledonia. The next day, we see Mason arriving home and receiving a warm embrace from his wife. Then Mason gets good news from Sebastian. Sebastian has transferred Mason's mission payment, a whopping $5.5 million. Learning this, Mason is undoubtedly delighted as he won't face financial difficulties anymore. Then the movie finally ended. So, what do you think of this movie? Did you enjoy the recap? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. One like and subscribe is highly appreciated. Share this video to your friends and family too. And that's about it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next videos.